Hana's fingers trembled as she stared at her phone screen, the blue light illuminating the tears streaming down her face. Her left arm throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that radiated from her wrist to her shoulder. She could still feel Minho's fingers digging into her flesh, could still hear the crack that made her stomach drop. The bruises were already forming, dark purple blooms spreading across her skin like spilled ink. She needed to tell someone. Anyone. Her best friend Jae-Min would understand. Jae-Min had been warning her for months about Minho's controlling behavior, the way he monitored her phone, the sudden mood swings that left Hana walking on eggshells. But admitting it out loud felt like failure, like confirmation that everyone had been right about him all along. Through blurred vision, Hana typed the message quickly, barely able to see the letters through her tears. Her hands shook so badly she had to retype it twice. He crushed my arm. She hit send. Before she could second-guess herself, then collapsed onto her bed, hugging her injured arm to her chest. The pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in her throat. How had she become this person? The girl who made excuses, who covered bruises with long sleeves, who smiled and pretended everything was fine when her boyfriend's grip left marks that lasted for days. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Hana reached for it, expecting Jae-Min's frantic response, maybe a string of worried emojis or an immediate demand to know where she was. But when she looked at the screen, her blood turned to ice. The message hadn't gone to Jae-Min. The number was unfamiliar, saved in her phone only as a series of digits she didn't recognize. She must have selected the wrong contact in her panic, her tears making it impossible to see clearly. And now a complete stranger had just read the most vulnerable, humiliating message she'd ever typed. "Oh God," Hana whispered, sitting up, too quickly. Pain shot through her arm and she gasped, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mortification flooding her system. "No, no, no!" She typed frantically with her good hand. "Sorry, wrong number." "Send. Please ignore it. Send. I'm so sorry." Her finger hovered over the send button for the third apology, when 3 dots appeared at the bottom of the screen. The stranger was typing. Hana held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Maybe they'd just say it was okay, that these things happened, that they'd delete the message and forget about it. The response came through, and Hana's world tilted on its axis. "Where is he?" 2 words. Simple, direct, but carrying a weight that made Hana's skin prickle with something that wasn't quite fear. The question wasn't, "Are you okay?" or "Do you need help?" It was immediate, focused, dangerous, as if the stranger had already decided that someone needed to answer for what they'd done. Hana stared at the message, her thumb frozen over the keyboard. Something in those 2 words sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in her room. There was an authority in that question, an expectation of being answered that she couldn't quite explain. "I don't know who you are," she typed back, her fingers steadier now despite her racing pulse. "Please just forget you saw anything." The response was almost instant. "I don't ignore things like this." Before Hana could process what that meant, another message appeared. "And I don't forget." Hana's breath caught in her throat. There was something final about those words, something that made her feel like she'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. She should block the number, should delete the entire conversation and pretend this never happened. But her fingers wouldn't move. She found herself reading and rereading those messages, trying to decipher the tone, the intention behind them. Who talked like that? Who responded to a stranger's accidental message with such immediate, unwavering certainty? It wasn't normal. It wasn't safe. And yet, Hana couldn't deny the tiny spark of something in her chest that felt almost like relief. For the first time in months, someone hadn't made excuses for Minho. Hadn't suggested she was overreacting. Hadn't implied that she must have done something to deserve it. This stranger, whoever they were, had simply asked where he was. As if that was the only question that mattered. Hana set her phone down with shaking hands and walked to her bathroom, running cold water over her bruised arm. The touch of the water made her wince, but she watched the way it pooled around her wrist, how the light caught on the discolored skin. She thought about Minho's face when he'd grabbed her, the way his eyes had gone flat and cold. He'd been angry because she'd smiled at a classmate, a boy from her literature course who'd asked to borrow her notes. That was all it took these days. A smile, a conversation. Anything Minho interpreted as a threat to his control. "You're mine," he'd hissed, his fingers tightening until she'd cried out. "Don't you ever forget that?" But was she? Was she really his? Or had she just been too afraid to leave, too worn down by the constant manipulation, to remember what it felt like to be free? Her phone buzzed again from the bedroom. Hana turned off the water and dried her hands carefully, then walked back to see what the stranger had sent. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let this bizarre conversation fade into nothing. But a larger part, the part that was tired of being scared and small, needed to know. The message on her screen made her knees weak. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to answer honestly. Where is he right now?" There was no threat in the words, but there was promise. A guarantee that something would happen if she answered. Hana sat on the edge of her bed, her injured arm cradled against her chest, and stared at that message for a full minute. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should stop this, should block the number and never think about it again. But the irrational part, the desperate part that was so tired of being hurt and scared, made her fingers move across the keyboard. "Who are you?" The response came so quickly she wondered if he'd already had it typed out, just waiting for her to ask. Someone who can help, or someone who can hurt him. Your choice. Hana's breath stuttered in her chest. There it was, laid out so simply. This wasn't a concerned stranger offering to call the police or suggesting she go to a shelter. This was something else entirely. Something dark and dangerous and completely outside the bounds of normal help. She should be terrified. She should absolutely be blocking this number and possibly changing her own. Instead, she found herself typing, "I don't want anyone to get hurt." "Too late for that," came the reply. "He already hurt you. I'm just evening the scales." Before she could respond, another message appeared. "Tell me where he is, or I'll find him myself. One way is faster. Both ways end the same." Hana's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was insane. This was completely insane. She was having a conversation with a stranger who was casually discussing violence as if it were a weather forecast. But underneath the fear, underneath the shock, there was something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "Why do you care?" she typed. "You don't even know me." The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before the response came through, and when it did, Hana had to read it 3 times to believe it was real. "I know enough. I know someone put their hands on you when they shouldn't have. I know you're scared enough to text the wrong number instead of calling the police. And I know that men like him don't stop unless someone makes them stop. So, I'll ask you one final time. Where is he?" Hana's vision blurred with fresh tears, but these felt different than the ones she'd cried earlier. These weren't tears of pain or humiliation. These were tears of recognition, of being seen in a way she hadn't been seen in so long. This stranger understood something that even her closest friends hadn't grasped. Minho wouldn't stop. Restraining orders were pieces of paper. Police reports were files in a drawer. He would keep finding her, keep hurting her, keep tightening his grip until there was nothing left of the person she used to be. Her fingers moved almost of their own accord. His apartment, Building 7, Unit 402 in the Riverside complex on the east side. The moment she hit send, Hana felt the world shift beneath her. There was no taking it back now, no undoing what she'd just done. She'd given a complete stranger her abusive boyfriend's address, and she had no idea what would happen next. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The response was simple, final. Good girl, stay away from there tonight. In fact, stay away from there permanently. Then, after a pause, and Hana, forget this conversation, but don't forget my number. You might need it again. She stared at her screen, her heart in her throat. How did he know her name? She hadn't given it to him. She'd been so careful not to reveal anything personal, and yet he knew. The realization should have terrified her, should have sent her running for help. Instead, it anchored something inside her, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Hana looked at her bruised arm, then back at her phone. She thought about saving the number, about keeping this bizarre lifeline open. But his instructions had been clear. Delete it, but don't forget it. Her finger hovered over the contact information, trembling slightly. Then she took a screenshot of the number, saved it to her photos, and deleted the entire conversation. The messages disappeared as if they'd never existed, but Hana knew she'd never forget them. Those words were burned into her memory, a promise from a stranger who'd somehow become her unexpected protector. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he would do. But as she lay back on her bed, cradling her injured arm, Hana felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in months. Safety. And underneath that, buried deep but growing stronger, was something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Who was this man who talked like violence was a language he spoke fluently? Who responded to a stranger's pain with immediate, decisive action? And why did the thought of him finding Minho make her feel less guilty than it should? 3 days passed before Hana saw him. She'd spent those days in a strange fog, going through the motions of her life while waiting for something to happen. Minho hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't shown up at her apartment at odd hours like he usually did when they fought. The silence was deafening, unnatural, and it made Hana's skin crawl with anticipation. She'd checked the news obsessively, searching for reports of violence or arrests in the Riverside complex. Nothing. It was as if Minho had simply vanished into thin air, and with him, any evidence that she'd sent a stranger to his door. But Hana knew better than to believe in coincidence. Something had happened. She could feel it in the way her phone stayed quiet, in the way she could walk to class without constantly looking over her shoulder. It was Thursday afternoon when she first noticed the car. Black, expensive, tinted windows so dark she couldn't see inside. It was parked across from the campus library, engine running, positioned in a way that gave it a clear view of the main entrance. Hana's steps faltered as she walked past it, her bag heavy with textbooks she hadn't been able to focus on reading. She told herself it was nothing, just another student with money to burn on luxury vehicles. But the car was there again on Friday. Same spot, same dark windows, same subtle menace that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. By Monday, Hana couldn't ignore it anymore. The car followed her routine, appearing outside her apartment building in the mornings, her favorite coffee shop during lunch, the library where she studied in the evenings. It never got too close, never did anything overtly threatening, but its presence was constant, watchful. She was being followed. Hana's first instinct was fear. Minho had found out what she'd done, had somehow discovered she'd sent someone after him, and now he was stalking her, waiting for the right moment to confront her. But that didn't make sense. Minho drove a beat-up sedan that barely ran, not a vehicle that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. Her second instinct, the one that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear, was that the stranger had found her. The realization came to her on Tuesday morning as she left her apartment for an early class. The black car was there, as always, but this time a man stood beside it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that looked tailored to fit his frame perfectly. He wasn't looking at her directly, but Hana knew with absolute certainty that he was aware of her every movement. She should have been terrified, should have called the police, should have run back inside and locked her door. Instead, she found herself walking toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs with something that felt more like anticipation than fear. "Excuse me?" she called out when she was close enough for him to hear. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Why are you following me?" The man turned to face her, and Hana's breath caught in her throat. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp features and eyes so dark they looked black in the morning light. There was a scar near his lip, thin and pale, that somehow made him more striking rather than less. He studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through all the layers she'd built up to protect herself. "Miss Kim," he said, his voice low and respectful. Not threatening, but not warm either. Professional. Distant. "I'm here on someone's orders. You're being protected." "Protected?" Hana repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "By who? I didn't ask for protection." The man's expression didn't change. "You asked for help. You received it. The protection is a courtesy." Before Hana could respond, before she could demand more answers or tell him to leave her alone, a second car pulled up. This one was different, sleeker, more expensive than the first if that was even possible. The windows were just as dark, but something about this vehicle radiated power in a way that made Hana's skin prickle with awareness. The back door opened and a man stepped out. Hana forgot how to breathe. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of presence that made everything around him seem smaller, less significant. His suit was black, perfectly tailored, probably worth more than everything in Hana's apartment combined. Dark hair fell slightly across his forehead, styled in a way that looked effortless, but was clearly intentional. But it was his face that made Hana's heart stutter in her chest. Sharp jawline, high cheekbones, lips that curved in a way that suggested he rarely smiled, but knew exactly how devastating it would be when he did. His eyes found hers immediately, and Hana felt the impact of that gaze like a physical touch. Dark, intense, and completely unreadable. He studied her with the same thoroughness as his guard had, but there was something different in his assessment. Something that made heat crawl up her neck despite the cool morning air. He moved toward her with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size, each step measured and purposeful. The guard stepped back immediately, giving him space, and Hana noticed the way the man's posture changed. This wasn't just respect. It was deference. Fear, carefully masked but present nonetheless. "Miss Kim," the man said, and his voice was exactly what Hana had imagined during those 3 days of silence. Deep, smooth, with an edge of authority that made it clear he was used to being obeyed. "I apologize if my men have made you uncomfortable. That wasn't the intention." Hana's mouth felt dry. She had to force herself to speak. "Who are you?" One corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to make her stomach flip. "You can call me Jae-Min, and I'm the person who received your message last week." The world seemed to tilt sideways. This was him, the stranger who'd promised to even the scales, who'd asked where Minho was with such casual certainty. But seeing him in person, feeling the weight of his presence, made those text messages seem almost quaint in comparison. This man was dangerous. Not in the way Minho was dangerous, with his unpredictable rages and violent outbursts. Jae-Min's danger was controlled, refined, like a blade kept sharp and ready, but sheathed until needed. "What did you do to him?" Hana asked, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Where's Minho?" Jae-Min's dark eyes studied her face, and Hana had the unsettling feeling that he could read every thought racing through her mind. "He's alive, if that's what you're worried about. Though, I'm not sure he deserves your concern." "I'm not worried about him," Hana said, and realized with a jolt that it was true. She wasn't worried about Minho at all. She was curious about what this stranger had done, about what kind of man could make someone disappear so completely. "I just want to know what I started." Something flickered in Jae-Min's expression, too quick for her to identify. He stepped closer, close enough that Hana had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He smelled expensive, like cedar and something darker she couldn't name. The scent made her dizzy, made her acutely aware of how much space he took up, how small she felt standing in front of him. "You started nothing," he said, his voice dropping lower. "He started it the moment he put his hands on you. I simply finished it." Hana's breath came faster. She should step back, should put distance between them, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. "And the protection? The men following me? That's you finishing it too?" "That's me making sure he stays finished." Jae-Min reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to. When she didn't, his fingers brushed against her left wrist, the one Minho had crushed. His touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the hardness in his eyes. "Show me." It wasn't a request, but somehow it didn't feel like a demand either. It felt like something else, something Hana didn't have words for. She found herself pushing up her sleeve, revealing the bruises that had faded from purple to a sickly yellow-green. They still hurt when pressed, still reminded her of that night every time she moved her arm the wrong way. Jae-Min's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. His fingers traced the edge of the bruises with a feather-light touch that sent shivers racing up her arm. When he looked up at her again, his eyes had gone cold in a way that made Hana's stomach drop. "He did this," Jae-Min said, and it wasn't a question. Hana nodded, not trusting her voice. "And you let me handle it." His thumb brushed across her pulse point, probably feeling how fast her heart was racing. "Do you regret that?" Did she? Hana searched her feelings, trying to find guilt or remorse for whatever had happened to Minho. But all she felt was relief, sweet and overwhelming. Relief that he was gone, that she could breathe again, that she didn't have to be afraid every time her phone buzzed. "No," she whispered. "I don't regret it." Jae-Min's eyes darkened with something that made heat pool low in Hana's stomach. His thumb continued its slow path across her wrist, and she wondered if he knew what that touch was doing to her, how it made her skin feel too tight and her thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. "Good," he said softly, "because no one touches what I choose to protect. And I've chosen to protect you." The possessiveness in those words should have set off alarm bells, should have reminded her that she'd just escaped one controlling relationship and had no business walking into another. But the way Jae-Min said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, didn't feel like Minho's jealous ownership. It felt like a promise, like a shield being raised between her and the world. "I didn't ask you to," Hana said, but the protest was weak. They both knew it. Jae-Min's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "No, you didn't. You asked me to handle someone who hurt you. I did. Everything else is my choice." He released her wrist slowly, his fingers trailing across her skin in a way that made her shiver. Then he stepped back, putting a careful distance between them that somehow felt more intimate than the closeness had been. "My men will continue to watch you," he said, his tone shifting back to something more businesslike. "You won't see them unless you need to, but they'll be there. If anyone bothers you, if you feel unsafe for any reason, you call this number." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and Hana's phone buzzed in her pocket. When she pulled it out, there was a new message from an unknown number. Just a single period, nothing else. But when she looked at the digits, her heart skipped. It was the same number. The one she'd deleted but memorized, the one she'd been trying not to think about for the past week. "You told me to delete it," she said, looking up at him. "I told you to delete the conversation," Jae-Min corrected. "I never said you couldn't have the number, just that you should be careful with it." "Why?" Hana asked. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm nobody." For the first time, Jae-Min's expression softened slightly. Not much, just enough for Hana to see that there was something beneath the cold exterior. something that looked almost like pain. "You're not nobody," he said quietly, "and I have my reasons." He turned to leave, and Hana felt panic surge through her chest. She didn't want him to go, didn't want to go back to her normal life pretending this hadn't happened. Before she could think better of it, she reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Jae-Min froze. Slowly, he turned back to her, his eyes dropping to where her fingers clutched the expensive fabric of his jacket. When he looked at her face again, there was something new in his expression. Something hungry and dark that made her breath catch. "Be careful, Hana," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Touching me like that gives me ideas." He should have frightened her. This stranger who commanded men with a look, who'd made Minho disappear, who watched her with eyes that promised both protection and possession. But Hana didn't feel afraid. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She felt seen and wanted and protected all at once. Comment below what you think Jae-Min did to Minho. Your theories might just be right. "What kind of ideas?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jae-Min's eyes flashed with something that made her knees weak. He reached up slowly and covered her hand with his fingers warm and strong against hers. For a moment she thought he might pull her closer, might close the distance between them and show her exactly what kind of ideas he had. Instead, he carefully removed her hand from his sleeve, but he didn't let go. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both possessive and tender. "The kind that would scare you if you had any sense," he said. Then he released her hand and stepped back. "Go to class, Hana. My men will keep you safe." He walked back to his car, every movement controlled and purposeful. The guard opened the door for him, and Jae-Min slid into the back seat without looking back, but just before the door closed, Hana saw him pull out his phone, his eyes lifting to meet hers through the tinted window. Her phone buzzed. "Don't forget to eat lunch. You skipped breakfast." Hana stared at the message, her heart hammering. He'd been watching her that closely? Knew her routines that intimately? She should feel violated, should feel angry at the invasion of privacy. Instead, she saved his number under a simple J and typed back, "How do you know I skipped breakfast?" The response was immediate. "Because I make it my business to know everything about what's mine." The possessiveness should have bothered her, should have reminded her of Minho's toxic jealousy. But it didn't. Because somehow being Jae-Min's felt completely different than being Minho's ever had. And that terrified her more than anything else. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of stolen glances and cryptic text messages that made Hana's heart race every time her phone buzzed. Jae-Min didn't approach her again. But his presence was everywhere. The black cars that appeared wherever she went. The way people suddenly gave her more space in crowded areas, as if some invisible force field surrounded her. The barista at her usual coffee shop who insisted her order was already paid for. Every single day, no matter how many times Hana tried to refuse. And the messages. God, the messages. They started simple. Reminders to eat, to sleep, to wear a jacket when the temperature dropped. But they evolved into something more. Something that blurred the line between protection and possession. In a way that made Hana's skin burn. "You were at the library until midnight. That's too late. Go home. The man who sat next to you in class today looked at you too long. He won't do it again. You looked beautiful in that blue dress. Wear it again sometime. For me." Each message was a reminder that Jae-Min was watching. Always watching. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it made Hana hyper-aware of herself, of her body, of the way she moved through the world, knowing his eyes might be on her at any moment. She found herself dressing more carefully, taking extra time with her appearance, even though she told herself it had nothing to do with him. She caught herself looking for the black cars, feeling disappointed on the rare occasions when she didn't see them. And late at night, alone in her apartment, she reread his messages until she could recite them from memory. It was during one of these late-night reading sessions that her phone rang. Not a text, an actual call. From Hana's hand shook as she answered. Hello? You're still awake. Jae-Min's voice was even deeper over the phone, rough around the edges in a way that suggested he might be tired, or drunk, or something else entirely. It's 2 a.m. So are you, Hana pointed out, her voice steadier than she felt. She was lying in bed, wearing an oversized t-shirt and shorts, and somehow knowing that he couldn't see her made her feel more exposed than if he'd been standing in front of her. I don't sleep much. There was a pause, and Hana heard the clink of ice in a glass. But you should. You have an exam tomorrow. How do you know that? I told you. I make it my business to know everything about you. The possessiveness in his tone sent heat pooling in her stomach. Hana pressed her thighs together, trying to ignore the way her body responded to his voice. That's creepy, you know. Following me, watching me, memorizing my schedule. I know. He didn't sound apologetic. Does it scare you? Hana closed her eyes, her free hand gripping her blanket. It should. But it doesn't. It wasn't a question. Somehow, he knew. He always knew. Why is that, Hana? She should hang up, should block his number and tell his men to leave her alone, should go back to her normal life and forget that any of this ever happened. But the truth was, she didn't want normal anymore. Normal had meant being afraid, being controlled, being hurt. This thing with Jae-Min was dangerous and wrong and completely insane, but it didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like safety wrapped in darkness, like protection with an edge of possession that made her feel wanted in a way she'd never experienced. Because you're different, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not like him. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Hana wondered if the call had dropped. Then Jae-Min's voice came back, lower and rougher than before. No, I'm not like him. I'm worse, Hana. I'm so much worse than him. The difference is I'd never hurt you, but I'd burn the world down before I let anyone else touch you. The intensity in his words made Hana's breath catch. Why? You barely know? Me. I know enough. Another pause. Another clink of ice. I know you take your coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream. I know you bite your lip when you're nervous and tuck your hair behind your ear when you're thinking. I know you study in the back corner of the library because you don't like being watched. And I know you haven't smiled, really smiled, in weeks. Tears pricked at Hana's eyes. He did know her. Better than people who'd been in her life for years. That's not enough to justify whatever this is. You're right. It's not. His voice dropped even lower, and Hana had to press the phone harder against her ear to hear him. But I'm going to do it anyway. Because the moment you sent me that text, the moment I saw those words, you became mine. And I don't let go of what's mine. Hana should protest, should tell him she wasn't his, wasn't anyone's. But the words wouldn't come. Because part of her, the part that had been scared and small for so long, wanted to be his. Wanted to be claimed by someone who saw her as something worth protecting, worth possessing, worth burning the world down for. I want to see you, she said before she could stop herself. The silence this time was different. Charged. Dangerous. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Hana. Her name was a warning, low and dark. You don't know what you're asking for. Then tell me. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. Stop hiding behind your men and your cars and your text messages. If I'm yours, if you want me so badly, then stop being a coward and face me. She heard his sharp intake of breath, heard the sound of glass being set down hard on a surface. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with barely controlled something. Anger, maybe, or desire, or both. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., a car will pick you up. Where are we going? Somewhere private, somewhere I can show you exactly what it means to be mine. The promise in those words made Hana's entire body flush with heat. Okay. Wear something nice, but not for anyone else. Only for me." Then he hung up, leaving Hana sitting in her dark bedroom, with her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest and heat pooling between her thighs in a way that made her ache. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Her mind was too full of possibilities, of images of Jae-Min in that perfectly tailored suit, of the way his eyes had darkened when he'd touched her wrist, of the rough edge in his voice when he'd called her his. By the time morning came, Hana had convinced herself a dozen times to cancel, to tell him this was too much, too fast, too dangerous. But every time she picked up her phone to text him, she remembered the way he'd looked at her bruises, the cold fury in his eyes, the gentle way his fingers had traced her skin. She went to her exam in a daze, barely able to focus on these questions. Her mind kept drifting to that night, to what somewhere private meant, to what he would do when they were finally alone together without guards or distance between them. Don't forget to like this video if you're feeling the tension between these two, and subscribe because things are about to get even more intense. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Hana went through the motions of her classes, her study sessions, her normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Everything felt heightened, electric, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. At 6 p.m., she stood in front of her closet, trying to decide what to wear. Jae-Min had said something nice, but not for anyone else. Only for him. What did that mean? She pulled out dress after dress, discarding each one. Too casual, too formal, too revealing. Not revealing enough. Finally, she settled on a simple black dress that hugged her curves without being obvious about it. It had a modest neckline, but a back that dipped lower than she usually wore, exposing the curve of her spine. She paired it with heels that made her legs look longer and took extra care with her makeup, keeping it natural but polished. By 7:30, she was pacing her apartment, checking her phone every 30 seconds, even though she knew the car wouldn't arrive until 8. Her nerves were shot, her hands shaking slightly as she touched up her lipstick for the third time. At exactly 8 p.m., her phone buzzed. "We're here." Hana grabbed her small purse, took one last look in the mirror, and headed downstairs. Her heart was hammering so hard, she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in every nerve ending of her body. The black car was waiting, sleek and expensive and somehow menacing, even just sitting there. But it wasn't the same guard from before who opened the door. This man was older, with gray at his temples, and eyes that had seen too much. He nodded respectfully as Hana approached. "Miss Kim, he's waiting for you." Hana slid into the back seat, and her breath caught. Jae-Min was there, sitting in the far corner, and the sight of him made everything else fade away. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored as always, but he'd loosened his tie slightly and undone the top button of his shirt. His hair was styled back, and in the dim light of the car, his features looked even sharper, more dangerous. But it was his eyes that captured her. They swept over her slowly, taking in every detail of her appearance with an intensity that made her feel naked despite being fully clothed. When his gaze finally met hers, there was heat there that made her stomach clench with want. "You wore black," he said, his voice low and rough. "Good girl." The praise made warmth flood through her. Hana shifted in her seat, suddenly hyper-aware of how small the space was, how close he was even though he hadn't moved. "You said something nice." "I said something nice for me. This is perfect." His eyes dropped to the modest neckline, then lower, taking in the way the dress hugged her waist. "Turn around." It should have sounded like a command. Maybe it was, but Hana found herself obeying without question, shifting in her seat so he could see her back. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the weight of his gaze on her exposed skin like a physical touch. "Damn," he muttered so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Then louder, "Face me." Hana turned back around and the look in his eyes made her breath stop. There was hunger there, raw and barely controlled. His hands were clenched on his thighs, as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. The car started moving, but neither of them looked away. "Where are we going?" Hana asked, her voice coming out breathier than she intended. "My place." Jae-Min's jaw was tight, his control clearly hanging by a thread. "Where we can talk without interruptions. Where I can finally stop keeping my distance." "And if I want you to keep your distance?" His lips curved into something that was almost a smile. Dark, dangerous, devastating. "Then you should have worn a different dress." The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like both an eternity and no time at all. They didn't speak, but the silence was heavy with unspoken things, with promises and threats and desires that neither of them could quite voice. Hana watched the city lights blur past the window, trying to calm her racing heart, trying to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. Finally, the car pulled into an underground garage of a building that screamed wealth and power. Hana had never been to this part of the city, where penthouses cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and security was tighter than some government buildings. Jae-Min got out first, then offered his hand to help her. The moment their skin touched, electricity shot up her arm. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and he didn't let go even after she was standing. Instead, he laced their fingers together and led her to a private elevator that required a keycard to access. The doors closed, sealing them in together, and the air grew thick with tension. Hana could feel Jae-Min's eyes on her, could sense him watching her in the reflection of the polished doors. Her skin felt too tight, her dress suddenly feeling like both too much and not enough coverage. "Nervous?" he asked, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "Should I be?" "Probably." He pulled her closer, turning her to face him. They were standing so close now that Hana had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "But I promise you, Hana, whatever happens tonight, you're safe with me. Always safe with me." The elevator doors opened directly into a penthouse apartment that took Hana's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, lights twinkling like stars against the darkness. The furniture was minimalist, but expensive, all clean lines and dark colors. Everything screamed power and control and money. But Hana barely noticed the apartment. All she could focus on was the man standing behind her, his presence filling the space, his heat radiating against her back. Jae-Min's hands settled on her waist, his touch gentle but possessive. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear as he spoke. "Last chance to run, Hana. Because once I show you who I really am, once I stop holding back, there's no going back. You'll be mine completely. Do you understand?" Hana's entire body was trembling, but not with fear. With anticipation, with want, with a need she'd never experienced before. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel his heart racing just as fast as hers. "I don't want to run," she whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. Show me everything." Something in Jae-Min's expression cracked, the careful control slipping for just a moment. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek with devastating gentleness. "You have no idea what you do to me," he said, his voice rough with barely restrained desire. "No idea how hard it's been to keep my hands off you, to watch you from a distance when all I wanted was to pull you close and never let go." "Then don't," Hana breathed. "Don't keep your distance anymore." Jae-Min's eyes darkened to black, and his hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her closer, so close that their lips were almost touching, so close that Hana could feel his breath against her mouth. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his control hanging by a thread. "Tell me to stop, Hana, or I won't be able to." But Hana didn't want him to stop. She'd spent months being afraid, being controlled, being hurt. This thing with Jae-Min was dangerous and possessive, and completely insane. but it was also intoxicating and protective, and everything she'd never known she needed. So instead of telling him to stop, she closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The moment their lips touched, the world caught fire. Jae-Min made a sound low in his throat, something between a groan and a growl, and then his control shattered completely. His hand tightened in her hair, angling her head exactly where he wanted it, and he kissed her like a man starving, like he'd been holding back for far too long and couldn't restrain himself another second. Hana gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss in a way that made her knees weak. His other hand slid down her back, tracing the bare skin exposed by her dress, and everywhere he touched felt like it was burning. She gripped his shirt, her fingers twisting in the expensive fabric, pulling him closer, even though there was no space left between them. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Jae-Min's eyes were nearly black with desire. His carefully styled hair mussed from where her fingers had run through it. He looked wild, dangerous, barely controlled. "Hana," he said, his voice rough and strained. "If we don't stop now, I won't be able to. I need you to understand that. Once I have you, I won't let you go. Ever." The possessiveness in his words should have frightened her, but looking up at him, seeing the raw hunger mixed with something that looked almost like reverence in his eyes, Hana felt nothing but certainty. "I don't want you to let me go," she whispered. Something shifted in Jae-Min's expression. The last traces of hesitation vanished, replaced by pure intent. He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her through the penthouse with purposeful strides. Hana wrapped her arms around his neck, her heart racing as he navigated through rooms she barely registered, focused only on the feel of his strong arms around her, the intensity of his gaze every time he glanced down at her. He set her down gently in what had to be his bedroom. The space was massive, dominated by a large bed with dark sheets that looked sinfully soft. More floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering city below, but Jae-Min moved to the wall and pressed something that made shades descend, cocooning them in intimate darkness, broken only by dim lights that seemed to activate automatically. Hana stood in the middle of the room, suddenly nervous despite her earlier boldness. This was real. This was happening. And the man stalking toward her with predatory grace was unlike anyone she'd ever known. Jae-Min stopped in front of her, his hands going to his tie. He pulled it off slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he started on the buttons of his shirt, revealing tanned skin and defined muscle beneath. Hana's mouth went dry watching him, watching the way he moved with such controlled confidence. "You're staring," he said, amusement coloring his tone. "So are you." "I've been staring at you for 2 weeks. He shrugged off his shirt, letting it fall to the floor. "Watching you walk through campus, watching you study, watching you exist in a world that doesn't deserve you. Do you know how hard it's been? Keeping my distance when all I wanted was this?" He closed the space between them, his hands settling on her waist, warm and possessive. Hana's breath hitched as he leaned down, his lips brushing against her neck just below her ear. "I've imagined this," he murmured against her skin, 1,000 different ways, but none of them compare to actually having you here, in my space, wearing a dress that's been driving me insane all night. His fingers found the zipper at the back of her dress, and he paused, his eyes meeting hers in silent question. Hana nodded, unable to form words, and he slowly drew the zipper down. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. The dress loosened, and Jae-Min eased it off her shoulders, letting it pool at her feet. Hana stood before him in just her underwear and heels, feeling vulnerable and exposed. But the way Jae-Min looked at her, like she was something precious and dangerous all at once, made her feel powerful instead of afraid. "Beautiful," he breathed, his hands skimming up her sides. "So damn beautiful." He kissed her again, slower this time, but no less intense. His hands explored her body with a thoroughness that made her tremble, learning every curve, every sensitive spot that made her gasp. Hana let herself get lost in it, in the sensation of being touched with such focused attention, such obvious desire. When they finally made it to the bed, Hana's entire body was humming with need. Jae-Min laid her down carefully, almost reverently, then stood back to look at her. The hunger in his eyes made her feel like she was the only thing in the world that mattered to him. "Tell me if I'm too much," he said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. "Tell me if you need me to slow down." "Don't slow down," Hana whispered. "Don't hold back. I want all of you." The last thread of his restraint snapped. What happened next was a blur of sensation and heat, an overwhelming pleasure that made Hana forget everything, except the man above her, around her, consuming her completely. Jae-Min touched her like he was memorizing every inch of her skin, kissed her like he was trying to brand himself onto her soul. And when they finally came together, when he made her his in every possible way, Hana understood what he'd meant about no going back. Because this connection that felt both forbidden and inevitable had changed something fundamental inside her. She wasn't the same person who'd accidentally sent that text 2 weeks ago. She wasn't the scared girl who let herself be hurt and controlled. She was someone new, someone claimed by a dangerous man who'd promised to protect her from the world while possessing her completely. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the dark sheets, Hana's head on Jae-Min's chest, listening to his heartbeat slowly return to normal. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she felt safer than she had in years. "Tell me about your sister," Hana said softly, the words surprising even herself. Jae-Min's hand stilled for a moment, then continued its gentle path. "How do you know about her?" "I don't. Not really. But you said you had your reasons for helping me. I think she's one of them." The silence stretched long enough that Hana thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, his arm tightening around her. "Her name was Ji-yeon. She was 3 years younger than me, and she was everything good in my world. Smart, funny, kind to everyone even when they didn't deserve it." His voice was distant, tinged with old pain. "She dated a guy who seemed perfect at first. Charming, attentive, everything you'd want for someone you loved. But behind closed doors, he was a monster." Hana pressed closer, offering silent comfort. "She hid it well," Jae-Min continued. "The bruises, the fear, the way he isolated her from everyone who cared about her. By the time I realized what was happening, by the time she finally asked for help, it was too late. He killed her rather than let her leave." "I'm so sorry," Hana whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I made him pay. Slowly. Painfully. But it didn't bring her back." His hand moved to cup Hana's face, tilting it up so he could see her eyes in the dim light. "When I got your text, when I saw those words, I saw her. Saw another woman being hurt by a man who thought he owned her. And I couldn't. I wouldn't let it happen again." Understanding dawned on Hana. "That's why you helped me. Why you've been so protective." "It started that way," Jae-Min admitted. "But it became something else. You became something else. The moment I saw you, Hana, the moment I watched you try to stay strong despite being scared, despite being hurt, I was done for. You weren't just someone to protect. You were mine." The possessiveness was still there, still overwhelming. But now Hana understood. It came from a place of loss, of never wanting to feel helpless again. Jae-Min wasn't trying to control her the way Minho had. He was trying to ensure no one could ever hurt her again. "What did you do to him?" Hana asked. "To Minho. I need to know." Jae-Min's jaw tightened. "Are you sure?" "Once I tell you, you can't unknow it." "I'm sure." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing her jaw. "I went to his apartment that night. Had a conversation with him about the importance of keeping his hands to himself. Then I gave him 2 choices. Leave the city and never contact you again, or stay and deal with the consequences. And he chose to leave? After some persuasion. Jae-Min's voice was cold. I made it very clear what would happen if he ever came near you again. Made sure he understood that even thinking about you would be a mistake. Then I had my men escort him to the airport and put him on a plane to Busan. He won't be back. Hana processed this. Part of her wanted to feel guilty, to feel sorry for Minho despite everything, but mostly she just felt relief. You didn't kill him. I wanted to. The honesty in his voice was startling. I wanted to make him suffer the way he made you suffer. But you asked me not to let anyone get hurt because of you. So I chose a different punishment. Thank you, Hana whispered, for listening, for not crossing that line. I'd cross any line for you, Jae-Min said, his eyes intense. But I'll try to honor your boundaries. That's all I can promise. They fell silent again, and Hana felt the weight of everything that had happened settling over her. She'd gone from being trapped in one relationship to being claimed by a mafia boss. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was probably the worst decision she'd ever made. But lying there in Jae-Min's arms, feeling cherished and protected, and wanted in a way that had nothing to do with control, and everything to do with possession that felt more like devotion, Hana couldn't bring herself to regret it. What happens now? She asked. With us. With this. Jae-Min rolled them over so he was above her, his weight pressing her into the mattress in a way that made her feel safe rather than trapped. He brushed her hair back from her face with surprising gentleness. Now you're mine, he said simply. You stay in your apartment, go to your classes, live your life. But you do it knowing that I'm watching, that my men are protecting you, that no one will ever hurt you again. And when you need me, when you want me, I'm here. Always here. That's it? I just go back to normal? His lips curved into a dark smile. Nothing about this is normal, Hana. You texted the devil by mistake, and now the devil is in love with you? That changes everything. Love. He'd said love. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. You don't love me, Hana said, but it came out more like a question than a statement. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're stronger than you think you are. I know you're kind even to people who don't deserve it. I know you bite your lip when you're nervous, and your eyes light up when you think no one's watching. I know the sound you make when I touch you here. His hand demonstrated, and Hana gasped. And here. I know that you're mine, and I'm never letting you go. If that's not love, it's close enough. Hana stared up at him, her heart in her throat. This was crazy. All of it. But looking into his dark eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously like the emotion he'd just named. This is going to be complicated, she whispered. I know. People will judge me. They'll say I traded one bad relationship for another. Let them talk. Your world is dangerous. The mafia, the violence, the things you do. I'll keep you separate from it. You'll always be safe. You're possessive and controlling and probably a little bit insane. Completely insane, he corrected with a slight smile. But only for you. Hana reached up and traced the scar near his lip, the imperfection that somehow made him more beautiful. I should run. I should go back to my normal life and forget any of this happened. You should, Jae-Min agreed, but he made no move to let her go. But you won't. How do you know? He leaned down and kissed her, slow and deep and devastating. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with promise. Because you feel it too. This thing between us. It's wrong and dangerous and completely insane, but it's also inevitable. You're mine, Hana. You were mine the moment you sent me that text. And I'm yours, whether you want me or not. And God help her. She did want him. Wanted this beautiful, dangerous man who'd stepped out of the shadows to protect her, who'd made her feel safe and desired and claimed all at once. It was crazy. It was probably the worst decision she'd ever make. But as Jae-Min kissed her again, as his hands mapped her body with possessive tenderness, Hana decided that maybe crazy wasn't so bad. Maybe dangerous was exactly what she needed. Maybe the devil wasn't such a terrible thing to belong to after all. Because for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. She was alive. And she was his. Completely, utterly, irrevocably his. Outside the windows, the city glittered with 1,000 lights, each one representing a different life, a different choice, a different path. But Hana wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the man above her, the one who'd promised to burn the world down for her, the one who'd shown her what it meant to be protected and possessed, and wanted all at once. "No going back," Jae-Min whispered against her lips. "No going back," Hana agreed, and as he claimed her again as they lost themselves in each other, the rest of the world faded away. There was no more fear, no more pain, no more questions about right and wrong. There was only them, only this, only the inevitable collision of two souls that had found each other in the darkness. She'd texted the devil by mistake, but maybe, just maybe, it was the best mistake she'd ever made. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in Hana and Jae-Min's story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Hit that like button if you're Team Jae-Min, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Until next time, remember, sometimes the wrong number is exactly the right one.